Hi everyone! Welcome back to book club. It's that time of the month, and I am so excited for this book club because, for a lot of reasons. First of all, we read Severance by Ling Ma. Now, I had heard a lot about this book, and a lot of people recommended it to me. I didn't know exactly what it was about and how close to home it was gonna hit when I assigned it, so for everyone that read along with me, I'm here and I feel you. It was a really intense time to read this book, but I'm also really glad that I assigned it. It just ended up being like kind of perfect and also kind of haunting. But that being said, we have Sarah McNally coming on to discuss the book and just in general to discuss independent bookstores and what it's meant to have an independent bookstore during the pandemic. McNally Jackson, for those of you who don't know, is a bookstore in New York. It is my all-time favorite bookstore. It's the bookstore that made me fall in love with reading, so I'm so excited and freaking out and just like, this would not exist without McNally Jackson, so that's why I'm so excited to be talking to Sarah today. Before I bring her on, I just want to talk a little about the book and kind of reiterate. So Severance is written by Ling Ma, who is a Chinese-American novelist. And Severance was her first book. It was written in 2018. So for those of you who read it, you might have thought it was written after this year. It was not. She wrote this in 2018, before everything that has happened. So I'm not saying she can see the future, but it's pretty crazy how it parallels a lot with what we've been through over the last year. So this book follows Candace Chen, who is a first-generation Chinese-American, and she's living in New York City in her 20-somethings, and she works in publishing, and it kind of follows her in flashbacks and then back to present time as the whole world goes through an epidemic, as they call it in the book, called Shen fever, which slowly obliterates global civilization. So it kind of follows her early life, her memories of her parents moving to America, and then kind of after, and what she's going through now, sort of post-apocalypse. So while this book is very apocalyptic, I think at its core it's really a family story, a story about what it means to be a first-generation Chinese-American, and it's been called a heartfelt tribute to the connections that drive us to do more than survive. So yeah, this book was kind of perfect for this time, but definitely as we get more into it, you'll see a lot of parallels to real life. And I pulled this quote from Zadie Smith that I loved about New York, and I just felt like it fit really well into how Ling Ma describes New York. And she said that Rome says enjoy me, London says survive me, New York says give me all you got. And I feel like Ling Ma's description of New York is really give me all you got. And the main character, Candace, really does. So, this book won so many awards. I absolutely loved it. At times my skin was crawling, but truly think it's an incredible book. Here's what it looks like. And so let's see if we can bring Sarah on and talk a little bit more about it. Kaia tries to use technology part 3562 and she still cannot, so that's also what book club is. But I just invited Sarah on, so let's see if we can get her on and talk a little bit about it. Also, I know a lot of people who watch these haven't read a lot of the books, but this is one, if I can tell you, like, if you want your minds to be blown that this was written before this year, I highly, highly recommend reading this book. I think it's like been enough time where we can reflect on this year, and this is kind of the perfect way to do it because she did write this, in 2018. So my mind is still blown after reading this that this was written way before. I can tell you, like, hello. If you want to blow.
Hi. Sorry, I was trying to do it on my computer and I don't think it was working.
You're so fine. I still am yet to like figure out how to use live streams, even though I do them all the time. So thank you for bearing with me.
Okay, I can sort of see your lovely face a little bit. I'm going to try and make it a little brighter. Okay, well, I can hear your voice. I think that's the most important thing, I guess, because we're all about the books and the words. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on here. You have no idea how much this means to me.
I heard thank you so much for saying that about the bookstore. I appreciated it.
Oh my gosh. No, I seriously, when I moved to New York, that was the first bookstore I ever walked into. And I am still the only bookstore in New York that I ever go to. So thank you for creating that place for people, because it really is like such a special place that you guys have.
Yeah, it's been 16 years now since I opened that bookstore. I almost can't believe it.
Wow.
It's so funny because I'm an immigrant myself. I'm from Canada, and
wow.
Yeah, I just had this. I'm very impulsive, and at 29, I just had this impulse to open this bookstore. And it's so funny now to think that I've created this thing that people will look back at New York and think of it as a New York bookstore, when I still feel kind of like an immigrant and an interloper myself. But
yeah, that it's become such a staple, like, to New York City, and yourself an immigrant. But what made you get into the book selling world? Like, what was it when you moved there that you were like, this is what I want to do?
My mom had bookstores in Canada. I'm from Winnipeg, which you probably don't know where that is. Winnipeg.
I do.
Yes, you're North Dakota. I mean, it's like it's not a place you bump into accidentally. It's very and so I grew up working from when I was 12. I worked in my mom's bookstore, and and then I came here. I really wanted to. I just love New York so much. I'd only been here for 3 days, and it's like true love at first sight when I set foot in this city, and which is now starting to feel like an old and tired marriage, but I'm still in it quite deeply. And so I moved here to work in publishing, which is what I thought I wanted to do, but I just about went berserk in the office environment. And so, yeah, so I kind of impulsively I inherited not that much money in retrospect. It seemed like a lot at the time. I inherited $250,000, and I just immediately opened a bookstore with it. And
wow.
Yeah.
I love that, because I feel like, if a lot of like young people get $250,000, they probably don't think to open a bookstore. So I love that that's where your mind was, and that's where your passion was.
Well, and at 29, you don't know you're young at 29. I didn't know I was young at 29.
Right. Yeah. I'm 19, and I think I'm really old. So I can only imagine what 29 feels like and beyond that. And you said you're in publishing, and the main character in this book is in publishing, and in an office job. And like, when sort of reading about her experience in publishing, like, did you see any parallels with your experience in publishing?
So have you never worked in an office? Of course you haven't worked.
No.
It's
I've never.
Yeah, it's a very strange. I only did it for 3 years, and it's incredibly hierarchical, which I thought that this book really did capture beautifully. The way that they're, I mean, she in this book, she can look into the boss's office and admire their, chaise longue or whatever it might be. But it really is hierarchical. You don't really have a chance to talk or speak up if you're at the bottom. And I think if in this particular book, her character is so kind of quiet and accepting of a lot of the whatever's going on around her until she snaps. And in an office environment, she can just quietly fit in. And by not putting her head up, by not saying anything, she lost 5 years of her life just doing production of
keeping her head down. And yeah, and it is like reading it from the perspective of someone who's never worked in an office. You kind of feel the pain sort of for her as she's describing the days and how they all kind of feel the same, and just the relationships to the people in the office. And I'm sure, she was also first generation, living in New York. Do you feel like that plays a role in sort of that feeling of fitting in and trying to keep your head down when you're in an office setting like that?
Well, it's interesting because it's working with your generation. Your generation seems to be less and less comfortable with that, putting your head down and keeping quiet and doing what you're told. I'm noticing that.
Yeah, no, we don't keep quiet at all.
So we'll see what happens in offices of the future, because it used to be that when you started in an office, no one listened to you for 5-10 years. No one cared what your opinion was. You were just there. And that is clearly changing. Young people are not accepting that anymore. I'm seeing that in publishing, certainly. But when 20 years ago, was in an office, it was still very much unusual. It was unusual if someone who was a new employee would actually speak up. Wait, what was your
Wow.
question? Your question, I forget what your question was. It was about being...
Just that, do you feel like, I mean, in general, just that, I know that idea of being in an office and keeping your head low and everything, but do you feel like being an immigrant plays a role in even having to, like, feeling like you have to do that even more to fit in?
I think possibly. I mean, it's very different being an immigrant from Canada than coming from Asia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
of course.
my language, and nobody can tell when they look at me that I'm not American, and people often assume I'm
Mm.
American until I say, like, there's certain words that I say,
Sorry.
right, or I still say
Yeah.
a sometimes. Um,
Uh-huh.
so it is a little different, but there is, I wonder, I mean, New York is so specific too. Just even if you move to New York from the Midwest, you're going to have a certain amount of insecurity about the way that people
Mm-hmm.
talk and act. And you do sort of at first, I think, you hear so many people and so many writers saying when they first come to New York, they try so hard to fit in and to lose their accent. And then they think, what was I doing? Why was I trying to be like everybody else? In fact, like that's the least
Right.
interesting life choice you can make.
That's
Yeah,
so true. Yeah.
yeah. But this poor young woman, I mean, as a daughter of first in the book, the daughter of first generation immigrants, I mean, she had no place that felt like home to her.
Mm-hmm.
And so when she came to, I mean, most people come to New York and they have a home that they could go back to. And New York is an
Mm-hmm.
experiment, but she had nothing else.
Right, right.
And yet she never felt, I don't think she ever felt like a New Yorker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I always wonder, like, because I moved to New York when I was, 17 from living in Malibu my whole life. And even that, I was in the same country, but even that felt like worlds away, but I always knew that I could come back. Like I had it, I feel like New York kind of always felt temporary, and probably even to you who's lived there a long time, like you always know there's something else drawing you, and like experiencing it through the perspective of someone who didn't have a home before that, I think was a very sort of interesting way to think about it, because not many of the people that I've talked to have experienced New York that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at this point in my life that I have 6 stores in New York and I have a son in New York,
Mm-hmm.
I've lived now longer in New York than I'm 45 and I moved here when I was 22, I think. So I've lived half
Mm-hmm.
my life in America.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it's become increased with every year. It becomes impractical for me to think about going back to Canada. I don't have the relationships,
Right.
but it wasn't until COVID, I think, that I felt bound to this city in a very, very deep, seeing this extraordinary city on her knees as
Mm-hmm.
was in March, April, May of last year made me kind of love her I keep calling her love it in a different
Yeah.
way than I ever had. Instead of
Yeah.
sort of aspiring to it, I loved her like a beast dying who you want to keep alive.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
But it makes sense, and I think like just like Candace in the book experiences, her love for New York really comes out, and her loyalty to New York really comes out in the midst of this tragedy of like when she's seeing her city basically burn in front of her, she
Mm-hmm.
sticks around the longest. And I think that's where you see like New York and almost the setting of a city becoming one of the characters in the book, because you really see her connection to the city be brought out by something like, I think, how COVID sort of brought it out in you. I think like she experiences a very similar draw to the city during that time.
Well, you have this young woman, I mean, this Candace, the main character in this book, who is essentially the last person, basically the last person left in New York who's not
Mm-hmm.
fevered. And she's broadcasting photographs of New York City to the rest of the world. And I mean, if there's a line somewhere in the book, I can't remember where it is, but she said that she feels like she was living more in the idea of New York than New York, that she knew
Mm-hmm.
the idea of
Like
New
the
York.
myth of New York, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Rather
Mm-hmm.
than like, and it is hard to actually kind of hold New York in your hands in a way. Sometimes you have such a good night, maybe you're out till dawn, things are so much fun, and you feel like you've kind of bit directly from the apple of New York. But normally you
Mm-hmm.
feel sort of like you're reaching for the apple on the tree.
Right.
And she definitely seemed to have that relationship with New York. She was really just biding time here, and all of her relationships were sort of circumstantial. She moved here with a bunch of college friends, and they were friends until they got jobs and they stopped seeing each other. Then she started dating a guy because she lived in the same building as him. Everything was just so circumstantial. She wasn't sort of forging her own life and her own path and really making New York what it was, but she ended up being the last person showing the world what was happening in New York. And what was it called? What was her blog called? Ghost New York, or
Yeah, New York Ghost.
New York Ghost. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like literature can really be used to sort of better understand human experience. And in general, with everything going on with Asian Americans right now, I felt like having this perspective from, you know, a Chinese American novelist and her experience of New York and her experience of New York in this sort of fantasy apocalypse that she's created that in a lot of ways resembles what is happening right now. How do you feel like, or do you feel like you've used literature to kind of better understand the experience of other people, especially when you live in New York, and how New York can be experienced in so many different ways?
It's interesting because, you know, when I first started the bookstore, which was not a million years ago, it was 16 years ago, the belief was that books would teach you how similar everybody's experience was. And there's a famous James Baldwin quote saying that it was books that taught him that he was basically the same as everyone who's ever been alive, and it made him feel close to everyone who's been alive. And that has become a less and less popular way to think about books and to think about reading. I mean, when I read about the Asian American experience, I realize I don't think, oh, I went through the same thing. I didn't. Right. It's not the same. And it really, instead of making me feel like I'm the same as we all have the same soul and heart and life experiences, it does really make, I think, me and other people make the leap to realize that we shouldn't assume that we understand each other. We shouldn't assume we know what it's like to be Asian American or African American, or to be Asian in China, whatever it might be. We shouldn't assume we know what it is. And it's like, you know, you hear it a lot when people say, like, for thoughtful listening, you know, when you're upset about something and you say to your friend, and your friend's like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's like, do you?
Right. And it's like, but can you listen? Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why literature is so amazing, is like it's I think the closest we can get to having empathy for people that we actually can't understand what they're going through. And, you know, you're an immigrant, but you're not a Chinese immigrant, and I'm not even an immigrant. So like I think we can sometimes feel very separated from the truth of what's going on, but like just sort of being able to read about her experience or her imagined experience, I think, at least for me, like helped me feel closer and more understanding to what was actually going on.
Yeah. So my internet's bad. I think my son my son promised me he wouldn't go on the internet during this hour, and I think he has. I can just feel a video game.
You're so fine. It's book club. We always have some technology kinks, and you're totally fine.
It's, you know, it's so wonderful, this technology, that like you and I can talk to each other from across the country about a book, but then it's not perfect.
No, and that's reality. But I was sort of, when I was reading it, and I know she talks a lot about severance, and, you know, severance has a lot of different definitions. It just can be, you know, cutting off, but also, you know, losing a job. Why do you think Ling Ma decided to call the book Severance? Do you think it was a play on sort of all the different definitions, or what did you gather?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an excellent title. It's really extraordinary, and I do think that there's certain things that this book brought to mind. Like there's a lot of mentions, obviously, of the Bible, since that's Candace's job, is packaging the Bible, and it seemed almost like severance. It's almost like a biblical sort of term, and this it's not, but it's severance. It's sort of dramatic. It reminded me a little bit of like American West narratives, where someone is kind of going off in a terrifying land and trying to stay alive, and it has the drama of these kind of classic American tales. So I think it was an extraordinary title, and she essentially, I mean, there's a couple of, I mean, she essentially does have to sever ties to everything in her life, which are already almost severed. I mean, she doesn't have strong ties already. And then, I mean, the other flip side of it is that it seems that this sort of pandemic, this being fevered, it's that nostalgia is kind of will make you sick. in a strange way, that if you go into an environment that you're nostalgic for, you're probably going to go into a habit loop, and then you're going to essentially become a zombie. And
Right.
there seems to be some like division in the book, which I don't know what you thought about this, but this division between sort of habit and nostalgia. I mean, she obviously has a lot of habit, but she's not really nostalgic for her job or any particular place, so she doesn't get
Right.
fevered. Yeah.
Right. It's so interesting that you bring up like habit and nostalgia. And there's a quote from the book where she's talking about, you know, the fevered remember and they keep remembering, but she's like, but I remember. I remember all of the time. And it's like the difference between being nostalgic and just remembering. And, you know, in this book, the fevered, and they're kind of these like zombie metaphors, but they don't eat humans, you know, they just get caught in repetitive cycles of doing the same thing over and over again. And it kind of made me think of the pandemic, of how we were all sort of forced into these cyclical patterns in these days that all kind of blended into one. Were there times over this year that you found yourself getting kind of caught in these patterns, whether they were nostalgic or not, of just like these cycles of, you know, kind of doing the same thing over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a year that's probably unlike most people's year, because I was like, for example, in March and April, the postal service essentially stopped working in New York City, and my bookstores, I have 6 stores. I have 4 bookstores, 2 stationery stores. They're all closed, and they were staying alive by people buying stuff on the internet, but the post office wasn't coming and picking up packages. So every day I was driving through the deserted streets of New York. I felt like the only car on the road. And I'd go to all of my stores and pick up all the packages, drive them to the post office in these like strange, dark, empty streets. It was
Wow.
so, in a way, this whole year has been trying to stay in business. So for me, that wasn't the case. I mean, this year I feel like I've never done more new and terrifying and difficult things, because with retail, which it's just not a good moment to be in it wasn't a good moment to be in
I
retail.
mean, yeah. I mean, tell me about that, because like that's a lot of what I was thinking about, was these like independent bookstores and just independent retailers in general. Like, what are independent bookstores up against right now with COVID? I know you're talking about that you had to literally pick up the books yourself. Like, what was that experience like?
I mean, it was that on the one hand, getting the support that we received from customers who, I mean, clearly buying from Amazon is more convenient than buying from McNallyJackson.com. I mean, Amazon has a whole infrastructure. They've got warehouses. You're going to get the books sort of probably within 24 hours. It's clearly easier for a customer. We were overwhelmed. We'd never really had a proper web service. When we first started doing it, it was taking us sometimes. Now we're fast and you're going to get your book within a week, but probably not the next day. When it first started, between the post office being a disaster and us not really knowing how to run a web business at first, you could have been waiting for weeks for the books from us. I mean, it was embarrassing, but it was embarrassing to do something. I've always thought, don't do something unless you can do a really good job at it. And suddenly we were doing a terrible job.
But you're kind of forced into these situations that you've never had to function in that way before.
And customers still were supportive, and they still came to us because they remembered in the real world what we'd offered. And yeah, I don't know. And then I started doing what you're doing. We started not book clubs, but these sort of seminars, these online book seminars. And they've been some of the most beautiful evenings of my life, is sitting with 12 strangers from around the country and having really deep conversations about literature. I've been, sort of peak happiness at some of those things. So there's been some, I mean, it's been financially terrible, but there've been some very beautiful moments within it that have sort of reminded me why I started doing this, why I got into the racket in the first place.
Yeah.
But
I think sometimes you do kind of need that to be reminded, because we get so stuck in our everyday life of what these patterns are and the things that we take for granted. And I have been saying recently, like, in a way this year we've all felt very disconnected and isolated, but at the same time I also feel like we've never been more connected, and it's kind of forced us all. Like, I wouldn't have started this book club if this hadn't have happened. And like, you know, you're saying with the book clubs that you've been doing, like, you do kind of want that human connection again. It kind of like brings people together in a way.
And it's more deliberate. I mean, one thing about this Severance is, like, when I said that all of her relationships felt very circumstantial, and they just happened to be. She was in a relationship with kind of with whoever was by. She got a job because she had a one night stand with someone whose brother was high. It was all so circumstantial. And COVID did make me realize that a lot of my life was quite circumstantial, far more than a lot of my, I was so social. I'd normally every night I'd have drinks with one person, dinner with another person. I was always out. And 6 months into COVID, I don't even remember who I was seeing. It was just sort of this blur.
Wow, yeah, that is, I mean, that, like, I could not have put it better, because you get stuck in these, like, oh, well, this person's around me and this person, and when you're really forced to, like, set those intentions and you're forced to be putting in more effort than before, it's like, who do we really care about? What relationships did we choose? That's why I felt like with Candace, at the end of everything, there was no relationship left that she had actually chosen, and nothing that she had ties to that she had chosen. And it was a very interesting way to kind of highlight that feeling of a lot of our lives end up just being circumstantial.
Yeah, and it was very painful, this with Candace. And at the end, when sort of the ghost of her mother if the ghost of her mother hadn't come back, it would have been unbearable. And she was too, I suppose in a post-apocalyptic novel, when like 99.9% of people are dead, that we're all alone at that point. The chance that you're going to kind of get through that with your nearest and dearest is pretty slim. I mean, she'd been alone before, though. But when the ghost of her mother comes through and helps her, that was really very beautiful. And I did fear for her at the very. Can we have spoilers in this book club?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I always spoil. Yeah.
I did. Good. I did fear for her at the very end when she's walking towards Chicago and she feels like she's walking into her ex-boyfriend's memories, that she's almost trying to get into a nostalgia, which made me fear she would get fevered.
Yeah, I mean, I almost felt like at the end she was maybe craving sort of like a nostalgic feeling. There's just something to like remind us that we are people and that we've had these experiences. And I also wanted to ask, like, how can friends and customers and people support small businesses right now, especially bookstores, when we can't actually be going in yet, hopefully soon, but like how can we best support you guys?
Well, my stores are open. I mean, they're all open. They're not open how they were. We're open at very limited capacities, so you might have to wait outside for a long period of time before going in. And then whereas previously you could have gone in and stayed for hours, there's nowhere to sit anymore, right? You can't really sit down anymore, so you kind of have to move on. And also if so I'm getting distracted by reading all these notes at the bottom. There's so many comments.
I know.
But you can't really sit anymore and stay for hours. And the longer you stay, the longer someone else has to wait outside in a line, so you feel sort of guilty. But our online game is definitely getting much, much better. But you can come to our stores. It makes more sense now to come at like maybe noon on a Wednesday rather than 3 o'clock on a Saturday, because the capacity is just really limited. Prince Street used to have hundreds of people in that Prince Street store that you went to.
Yeah, I mean, all the time I'd go in, and it was like a little community, and I loved sort of how I could tell every single person working there, every single person in there cared so much, and you had just like sort of harbored this community of real book lovers, and everyone really wanted to be there. And I truly like credit everyone there for sparking my love of reading, and I just cannot thank you enough for everything that you've done, because I know me and many people feel the same way about McNally Jackson.
It's a little odd right now because they haven't, for some irritating reason, they haven't let retail workers get the vaccine yet. They've got restaurant workers, but not retail workers. And so the booksellers, by and large, are not vaccinated yet. And so they're still they believe in the books and they want to be there, but they're afraid. They're out there.
Of course.
Very frustrating.
Of course. And I mean, if it were up to me, I'd have everyone who works with books go first.
Right. And everyone,
because I mean, it's so important. And like for me, moving to New York, not really having friends and feeling very lonely at times, like that really was a safe haven to me, and in a lot of ways I felt like kept me going and gave me a safe place to go to where I felt like I belonged and could find people who, you know, enjoyed the same things as me. And like that's why to me I can't imagine it was essential to me, so I can't imagine it not being deemed essential sort of in the terms of today.
That's nice. That's really nice. I do feel like a neighborhood without a bookstore is it's like missing its public space. That like when you open a bookstore,
Mm-hmm.
you have stores, you've got streets, you've got everything, but when you have a bookstore, you actually have a place where anybody can feel at home. Anybody,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a book for
Yeah.
everybody
Mm-hmm.
on anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah. What
I
about you?
couldn't agree more.
Did you get stuck in habits during COVID?
I did a bit, but I kind of feel very similar to you where I think it forced us to invent new ways of surviving and changing those patterns and being more intentional about our patterns. Like I felt like I was trying to create patterns, but being very intentional about them rather than just falling into the same old ones. And I'm actually very grateful for those. I think, yeah, it's like from disaster, normally I think good things can come. So I was trying to focus on that.
Hmm. And to try, and I forget who said it. I read it recently, something like, if you want to know your future, look at your habits.
Mm-hmm.
Really,
Wow.
yeah, which
Yeah.
in this book is a very intense way. Like it's like if you want to know your zombie self, look at your
Yeah.
habits. But if
Yeah.
you want to know your future, look at your habits. But it was the time that there's enough. We've all had enough space in the last year to really think about what our habits
Mm-hmm.
are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if you could recommend one book for me to do for book club,
Oh my God, one. Okay, one.
queen of all books, what would it be?
One. One's not very much. Okay. Do you want to? Okay, Larry McMurtry just died, and
Oh,
have you ever read Larry McMurtry?
mm-mm.
Okay, I would maybe, and this is maybe, well, first I was thinking maybe if you want to do another Asian American, this Interior Chinatown book is amazing.
Oh, you know,
One of-
I think I have that.
It's
I've heard it's
it's
amazing. Yeah.
it's wild and creative and strange. And if I
Mm-hmm.
mean you're a California person, I think it would be really interesting too. It's about film. It's about yeah. This book is wild. But then
Okay.
Larry McMurtry just died, and he wrote this book called Lonesome Dove, which is really, it's amazing, kind of demythologizing the American West. I mean, it's an American West
Oh,
story, not what you'd expect, and the characters, the dialogue, it's incredible. It's really moving. And
okay.
it's just, yeah, I don't know, maybe, I mean, Severance might have sort of got me. I mean, Severance, frankly, depressed me. I was depressed.
I did not know the extent at which it really would hit close to home when I assigned it because I it was it your first time reading it or had you read it before?
I don't, I never read post-apocalyptic. After The Road by Cormac McCarthy, I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. It's too depressing.
Yeah,
So
it's a torture. It really is a form of torture.
but I
Especially
couldn't,
right now when it's, you know.
so real. But I couldn't put it
Yeah,
down. I just couldn't put it down. Like I
yeah. I
canceled everything and just read and read and read till it was done.
Well, that's a sign of a good book. And I so appreciate you coming on here. This means the world to me. And I promise when I'm back in New York, the first thing I'm doing is going into McNally Jackson
Oh,
because
I,
I truly, that is the one thing I've missed the most from, you know, being in California this whole time. There really isn't a bookstore here that I've found that. So I do appreciate McNally Jackson on a whole new level now.
thanks for saying so, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that